There is remarkably little discussion about the solution. In framing the discourse about global warming and climate change as a so called climate emergency, Extinction Rebellion, a British based group, has been very influential in their strategy of never endorsing, never discussing any possible solution, fashioning their political movement in terms of exclusively complaining about the problem. And to paraphrase Greta Thunberg, but it's not too much of a paraphrase, saying that the government must do what it is the scientists are demanding. You remember Greta saying that quite a few times? Listen to the scientists. I am not telling you that I know the solution. I'm telling you. Scientists are deeply flawed individual people, and they are produced by profoundly corrupt and dysfunctional universities, academic institutions. We are not in a position to simply listen to the scientists, trust the scientists. And the scientists, understandably, are preoccupied with measuring the size of the problem and not with engaging in the sort of engineering that would be involved in trying out and testing possible solutions. Now, I've known quite a number of climate scientists face to face. It's not worth getting into a digression as to why that is, but when I lived in Cambridge, England, a woman who was like my roommate, was actually a housemate. We had different rooms in the same rented house kind of thing. She was herself a kind of an elite level climate scientist. A lot of that happens in Cambridge. A lot of it happens in Switzerland. I think Zurich, one of the major cities in Switzerland. So there were sort of little particular centers where international experts gather for colloquia and to publish their findings and to have meetings. So I happened, it was really just due to the necessity of renting an apartment somewhere. I happened to know one of those people, and there have been quite a number of other people in that field I've bumped into. I have also bumped into and talked to a few different people involved in, shall we say, space travel, space exploration. Just by happenstance, I've met and spoken to some of those people, and I've talked to them about this subject of solutions. I think there is an interesting psychological, cultural, and ethical question to be asked. Why is it that people who tell you they have devoted their lives to climate change, to ecology, broadly speaking, or to global warming, why is it that they are not committed to solutions? And I would say very simply, this is because they do not want to endure the discomfort in their own daily life that a serious commitment to any solution would entail. I'll just give you two examples up front. We're going to get into what the available methods are in just a moment. But these people do not want to eat a vegan diet. They do not want to give up owning and driving a car. They do not want to give up taking international flights, many of them frivolous and unnecessary international flights. And indeed, very often these people are flying around the world constantly, back and forth to Africa, back and forth to Zurich, Switzerland, or what have you, for where these conferences are. They are often intensely aware of the extent to which their own their own ecological footprint, their own impact on the carbon balance of the atmosphere is much, much worse than the average person. Certainly, I mean, it's not just worse than the average person living in a wealthy country. It's much worse than a person living in a third world country, a person living in poverty. Broadly speaking, even if these people don't endorse or sympathize with veganism, broadly speaking, they're aware that 1 billion people living in third world conditions, in poverty, in Africa, the ecological impact is dramatically different from 1 million people living in the United States of America, 1 million people living in Japan, 1 million people living in Western Europe, in any wealthy nation. Now, again, footnote, the percentage of your diet that happens to be meat is a huge part of this, but it's not everything. It's not. So in a sense, there's a strange sort of wisdom in the insane ranting of Jordan Peterson on this issue. Jordan Peterson's concern is that there will be a left-wing conspiracy to drag us all back to the Stone Age, to drag us from living in first world standards of living, first world levels of affluence and luxury, to living in more third world, traditional, ancient, technologically limited conditions. So I think on an individual level, when you look at people who have become gormless conformists within the academic system, which is a deeply immoral, profoundly corrupt, utterly dysfunctional system, when you look at the people who've made the commitment to getting a PhD in any of the sciences, you're already pardon me, you're already looking at a very strange subset of humanity. And unlike Greta Thunberg, I am very glad that these decisions are instead being made by politicians. I would much prefer to have a direct democracy, but even if we have a very indirect form of parliamentary democracy, I am very happy to see congressmen and senators and parliamentary representatives debating these things, and not the type of utterly despicable person who gets a PhD in climate science and nevertheless continues eating hamburgers every day, nevertheless continues driving a sports car every day and taking international flights. And that is exactly who we're talking about here. We're talking about people who, in ways that are profound and ways that are shallow, they are both deeply committed to ignoring the solutions, and also in a shallow sense. So again, I won't dox this person, but I remember there was one guy who was a climate science, very powerful expert, and attending all these conferences. And let me tell you, these people lived in a tight orbit around me in Cambridge. I went to the same grocery store I went to and stuff like that. You saw them around without meaning to. Him and his wife and his kids. All of this guy's time and effort was going into cheating on his wife. And he was an older guy. I mean, he looked 65. I don't know his age. He was, all of his time and effort was going into getting drunk at the bar with women other than his wife. It's a lot of time. Getting drunk takes time, and recovering from the hangover takes time. But all of his time and effort was going into meeting up with and having sex with and getting drunk with women other than his wife. It's certainly a time-consuming hobby. So, well, here you are. You of all people, you have the expertise to realize the extent to which we're sitting like on a precipice. Here we are looking forward to the end of the world. And what are your priorities in life? Now, again, you can look at this in different ways. You can say, oh, well, this is someone who is kind of uniquely evil. And you could say this is just kind of an average British guy. In what ways is he not average? He's more of a conformist than other people, right? He is the type of person who gets in the system, doesn't ask any questions, doesn't challenge authority figures, who fills out all the paperwork and goes through and loses more than 10 years of his life getting a PhD. Again, I don't know in his case if it was 10 years or 15 years, but you can lose a lot of years getting to that level. And he now, as an older man, again, I'm sorry, if he was in his 50s, he looked like he was in his 60s. The drinking and smoking and so on doesn't help. And the meat diet doesn't help. He was totally carnivore, not a vegan in any way. And he feels that he's entitled. He feels that he is entitled now to this life of privilege and self-indulgence. He does not see himself as a soldier in the midst of a war. He does not see himself as a revolutionary in a cave. He does not see himself as fighting to save the planet. He doesn't see himself as fighting to save his own neighborhood or his own family. He had a wife and kids. He was just cheating on the wife with other women. He does not see himself as fighting for the future of his own children or anything else. Homo sum nihil alienem puto, as we say in Latin. I am human. Nothing is entirely alien to me. It's not too hard to put yourself in his position and think of all those years doing chemical equations, this incredibly boring work that entitled you to now be in this position as an expert. And there's a kind of sensual revenge. Should I say sensuous revenge? He's now engaged in this kind of brute sensuality and self-indulgence that perhaps he denied himself for many years when getting into this position of wealth and power, and to some extent, fame within his field. He's a famous guy. And I do think, we saw this all the time at Cambridge and Oxford and these universities. A lot of these guys they're sleeping with the female university students, whether those are PhD students or what, whether or not they're so shocking. There are these younger women who are impressed by their stature and accomplishments. But a lot of these guys also just straight up pay to sleep with prostitutes. Okay. This has been my digression to say scientists are human too. And the fact that, let's say in particular, you were a scientist who devoted years of your life to the calibration and analysis of the temperature measurements in the oceans from buoys, right? That doesn't mean you're a genius in any way whatsoever. We've had to learn, in our culture over centuries, the fact that you're really good at playing the guitar doesn't mean you're an intellectually good person. The fact that you're really good even at composing a new piece of music, whether that's for the guitar, for the violin, or otherwise, the fact that you're a good music composer doesn't mean you're intellectually a good person. And then the next step is, being really good at playing the guitar, it doesn't mean you're ethically a good person. Intellectually, ethically, and emotionally, you can be a fucking terrible person and be a rock star, or you can compose classical music. You can have talent in a given field while utterly lacking the positive qualities we look for intellectually, ethically, and emotionally. And boy, oh boy, when we're talking about success in the sciences, and when we're talking about our utterly corrupt, morally bankrupt, dysfunctional academic system, what it takes to get the credentials to have a shot at being successful in sciences, it's worse. Like, I'm seriously saying to you, the intellectual caliber of people you meet in the creative arts is much higher. It's much better than what you meet in the sciences. Definitely the emotional and ethical side. A lot of people in the arts do cultivate that. They do develop a lot as people, and they keep learning as they go older. And people in the sciences do not. I've had a lot of requests, actually, to make a video about talking about why I have such a negative view of computer programmers as a class. But in brief, you can imagine computer science is an even more abyssal subset. This is an even darker and deeper subset of the type of people who are successful in the sciences, and you see them overrepresented here on YouTube, overrepresented on the internet generally. Okay, so two things we've already set out, two chess pieces we've set on the board. One, the type of people who have engaged with this issue as activists, like Extinction Rebellion, have a very strong bias not to deal with solutions, only to deal with the problem, right? Crying, the sky is falling, but not being interested in the solution. What is it that's going to hold up the sky? Right? Two, the people who are scientists for different reasons in a different way, likewise, don't want to deal with solutions. And I guess the nicest thing I can say is there sure is a whole hell of a lot of work involved just in measuring the problem, just in proving to people precisely what the problem is. So one of the people I met was doing research into, I'm sorry, this was described to me. I didn't actually meet this person. I was like talking to someone who was friends with this other climate scientist. But anyway, there was a climate scientist doing research into the pika, that we normally refer to as the northern pika, and some of these very specific species of animals, and predicting at what point the animal goes extinct, at what point the plants it uniquely relies on in terms of its evolution, like that plant isn't flowering anymore or isn't flowering in the right season. What exactly are the factors that will lead the northern pika, also known as the pika, to go extinct? And you can imagine how you fill out an application form and the government gives you funding for that. And then you meet someone else and they're looking at a particular swamp. You meet someone else and they're looking at farming a particular type of fruit, how certain types of farming is going to have to change when the temperature goes up a certain amount, how to make drought-resistant crops work in Africa. There are so many specific particular things you can sink the scientific research in. The most flattering thing I can say is they certainly have distractions. There are other ways for them to spend their time and other ways for them to earn money than dealing with solutions. And here's the third factor. The solutions are kind of morally embarrassing to us all. I've already mentioned the extent to which it requires that you personally change your life. Well, also socially and politically, the solutions which are available, that are attainable, they involve sacrifices. They involve, okay, we're going to have to deal with some consequences rather than others. Now, I'm going to give you right now, I've never seen any discussion of this. I've never heard any discussion of this, not even when attending Green Party events. One of the most brutal and reliable ways to actually alleviate climate change and avert the disastrous results of, higher levels of carbon in the atmosphere. One of the best ways to mitigate this is simply to stretch out massive amounts of reflective material covering over the deserts of the world. So you can imagine the Gobi Desert, you can imagine the desert outside of Las Vegas, and you say, you know what, to reflect more of the sun's rays back out into the atmosphere, we are going to take a cheap material like mylar. Visualize when you open a bag of potato chips, you tear open the bag and there's this thin, reflective, mirror-like material inside, and we are going to stretch out over the desert or over grassy areas, over earthen areas, whatever you want to imagine. We're going to stretch out a huge expanse of this, and then guess what happens? When the sun's rays hit the surface of the earth, a much larger percentage of them are reflected back out into the vastness of space. And if you just imagine yourself being in orbit around the earth and looking down on the earth, right, you're going to see this gleaming expanse where what used to be a desert soaking up the sun's rays is instead now a mirror-like glimmering expanse, reflecting much more light back out, right? Now, the first thing you may think is, oh, wouldn't that destroy the ecology of the desert? Yes! Yes, motherfucker, it would. Yes, drastic times, drastic problems call for drastic measures. That's what we're talking about in this video. We're talking about actual solutions, and this is why I'm starting with this example. Nobody wants to deal with it. Nobody wants to deal with a solution that's not invisible and decentralized, right? Nobody wants to deal with a solution that's not aesthetically pleasing. Nobody wants to deal with a solution that doesn't make us feel good about ourselves, right? Like, oh, I use this recycled plastic bag. I feel virtuous. I feel good about myself. As opposed to, I'm the motherfucker who decided we don't need that desert. It could be anything. We don't need that grassland. All of the rabbits burrowing in that grassland can die because what we really need is to cope short term with climate change. Now, I'll just digress on this briefly. The reason why I like to say things like mitigate climate change, you can Google really briefly parts per million carbon. As the amount of carbon in the atmosphere increases, there are some aspects of it we have no way to mitigate. And the most terrifying is ocean acidification. So as there's more and more carbon in the atmosphere, that changes the acidity of the ocean for the same reason that carbonating a beverage, you make a beverage like Coca-Cola or just carbonated fizzy water with no sugar and no other flavoring, the pH balance, the acidity is different just because of the exposure to carbon. So in the same way, there are some problems caused by higher levels of carbon we have no way to cope with. So the point is, even if you do reflect vastly more sunlight out of the earth, if you reduce the temperature that way, you cope with this, there will be other knock-on consequences of higher carbon levels that are not dealt with, that are not mitigated. Okay, but this is an emergency. Everyone says emergency. Everyone says crisis. Why is it nobody is talking about drastic measures to deal with the crisis? Now, some of you will already anticipate where I'm going with this. Some of you won't. The type of reflection we're talking about there, and you can do a straight up cost-benefit analysis. Is it more expensive and is it more effective to instead reflect away some of the light hitting Earth using satellites in orbit? Now, when I say satellite, you're probably imagining something very expensive and very sophisticated. A satellite that can gather together signals from millions of cell phones and transmit them around the world and transmit them to other cell phones, that's sophisticated. A satellite that's involved in broadcasting cable television, movies, relaying these signals around the world, that's expensive, that's sophisticated. A military satellite that's capable of doing military intelligence or coordinating the motion of missiles, launching and firing missiles, that's sophisticated, okay? When I say you need a satellite array that reflects away incoming sunlight, it can be every bit as simple as a bag of potato chips. Again, think about ripping open a bag. You have this very thin layer of reflective metallic plastic is what it is, not even metal. You could send up a satellite that is just as simple as a roll of aluminum foil, aluminium for my British viewers. You know, you can have a satellite that's like a roll of aluminum foil. It unrolls, and then it just sits there in orbit, and you could have thousands of them. So compared to having a working solar array, doing something sophisticated, This is much cheaper and much simpler. So I'm just saying, you can get into cost estimates. Is it more effective? Dollar for dollar, right? Is it more effective in terms of the measurement of the total amount of energy coming in from the sun and what's deflected, to, instead of reflecting it on the surface of the Earth, take it up one level and deal with low Earth orbit, near Earth orbit, this stratum of this kind of very simple satellite. Now, the news this week is that the South Pole, the Antarctic, is falling apart. One of the advantages of this kind of solar reflective array in orbit is that you can put it anywhere. You could have it just covering the Antarctic Ocean, where there are either zero human beings or very, very few. If you think about a belt of these in the water just off the coast of the solid ice mass, right? That's going to be reflecting out into space light that otherwise would be striking the ocean, would be absorbed into the ocean. And again, obviously, there's going to be a local cooling effect of this. You're going to help save or possibly reverse. I mean, you do a calculation of that. How much sunlight do you need to block to actually reverse the effects of global warming for the Antarctic? Okay, but you're at least protecting the ice mass. They're having a local cooling. But then obviously there's a global total effect. You're reducing the total amount of sunlight coming into the planet, total temperature for the whole ocean and for the whole world. So just mention aesthetically, if that's your concern, you don't want to look up at the sky and see satellites causing dappled shade or what have you. You don't want to see a constant eclipse of the sun or something. Okay, you can do it over the South Pole, you can do it over the North Pole, you can set it up anywhere. But again, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, this is not really a scientific problem anymore. This is now an engineering problem. This is getting into practical questions of manufacturing and deployment and implementation. A lot of you have heard this idea before on this YouTube channel, on à-bas-le-ciel. You've never heard it from Greta Thunberg. You've never heard it from any of the leaders of Extinction Rebellion. I'll be honest with you, I've never heard it from a single vegan YouTuber. I've never heard it from a single ecological. I have never heard any discussion of this issue anywhere. Just to give a quick contrast, there are two solutions that don't work that have been scientifically debunked that I do still hear discussed. One of them was the fantasy that we could deal with climate change by increasing the amount of iron in the ocean. So again, why it is some of these ideas latch on, why people like certain fantasies and others. But the thesis there was that the crucial limiting factor for the bottom rung of the food chain in the ocean, so tiny, tiny single-cell plant organisms, single-cell amoeba-like organisms, that the lack of iron or the scarcity of iron was a limiting factor, and that if we just dumped barges of iron filings, basically of flakes of iron into the ocean, that this would result in blooming, an explosion of biomass in the ocean, and that this would have a knock-on effect for taking carbon out of the atmosphere and restoring the balance of the earth. It's not true. It doesn't work. And it's the sort of idea that on a chalkboard looks good. Real-world food chains don't work that way. Real-world ecology doesn't work that way. And we actually, ironically, I have a great example that relates to the other side of climate change. If someone wrote it out in a chalkboard and said to you, oh, well, the crucial limiting factor in how many trees we can have and how many forests we can have is carbon dioxide. Like plants grow slowly because of scarcity of carbon dioxide. If we have more carbon dioxide, plants will grow more rapidly. Now, I have read a detailed scientific study examining the extent to which it's true, and it's this much true to a tiny, tiny extent. It's slightly true. There are some plants where you can measure a growth spurt where at one stage they manage to grow a little bit faster because of the abundance of carbon as opposed to the scarcity of carbon. But there are all these other constraints on how quickly plants can grow and how many plants can grow and so on and so forth, including, as you can imagine, the fertility of the soil, competition with other plants, animals that come and eat you. When you look at the reality of how a forest works and how it grows, it turns out just the one factor of carbon is really not that significant in increasing the biomass. Oh, right. Sorry. And I should mention this also. When you talk about cost, again, it's interesting the way human beings fasten on some solutions rather than others. People are enthusiastic about this idea of having rooftop gardens. Can you imagine why? Oh, we're going to solve climate change through rooftop gardens. Okay, the effect of rooftop gardens is more than zero. to cover all of Tokyo with rooftop gardens would be unbelievably expensive. It would be an unbelievably inefficient way of dealing with climate change. Why do I see absolutely no discussion of taking the most effective technology that we have for reflecting away light, which, in my opinion, you can talk about something mirror-like, like Mylar, like a thin plastic sheet. But, to my knowledge, the most effective way to reflect light that human technology has developed is the high-tech reflective paint that the U.S. military uses. When they want a white stripe that reflects the most light possible, they did all the research that they got paint that you can paint onto asphalt, like onto a runway. They got paint that you could paint onto an aircraft, whether it's an aircraft made of aluminum or steel. They got paint. It may just look white in a photograph. You see it in real life, like, whoa, how's that scientifically possible? They have paint that reflects more light than anything in nature and anything else that's man-made. Gee, why don't I see any discussion of just taking sheet metal and painting it with this reflective material and covering up rooftops with that? Oh, well, rooftop gardens are pretty. Rooftop gardens are kind of good for the landlord. I get it. It's good for tourism or something. Again, it's about virtue signaling. Oh, it makes me feel good about myself to have a rooftop garden. Fuck your rooftop garden. The world is ending. If we want to talk about increasing the reflective capacity of urban areas, it's going to have to get ugly. The same way I was talking about covering up a desert with a reflective array, we're going to have to commit to doing some things that make us uncomfortable, right? Like if you want to, instead of having, the kind of black asphalt rooftops, and I've seen this tar paper, it's not really asphalt, but tar paper roofs, maybe you've got to go around and put up reflective arrays on every rooftop in a city. Now, again, the problem is the cost is going to be high. Still, gardening, this is expensive. This is a labor intensive, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the end, you just get grass, right? So you're talking about the difference between grass and tar paper or grass and concrete. Okay, it's a difference. And you can measure it. And I've seen estimates of that. Like, what if everything in Tokyo does this kind of rooftop gardening? What would the difference be? Okay, the difference between, concrete and grass is a difference. Okay, what about the difference between concrete and the most reflective material science can devise, which is not grass? Okay, and it's not a garden growing plums either, and it's a whole lot cheaper than a garden growing plums on your rooftop. And we can deploy it at a massive scale. The whole city of Las Vegas in the desert can have rooftops that shine out this way. All right, but what I don't know is then what about the next comparison? This type of rooftop adjustment. How does it compare to near Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, satellite reflection? These are the things we have to get into. Have you heard this discussed on the news once in your fucking life? They have conference after conference. Have you ever heard it reported? Oh yeah, there was a conference, whether it's a conference in Switzerland or what. There was one recently in Scotland, in Edinburgh, was it? Either Edinburgh or Glasgow. Okay. Did you hear? Oh yeah. And then they sat down at this conference in Glasgow and they went through the estimates for using different kinds of reflective rooftop arrays and of wiping out huge areas of grassland and, to have reflective arrays as opposed to orbital arrays. No, it's just the extent to which this is in an oubliette that's unthought of and not dealt with. And again, we'll get into, I think there is a psychological reason. I think it reflects, frankly, the religiosity of our times, the things we implicitly believe in, what it is that to us is thinkable and unthinkable, what it is we're willing to actually consider in a world where nobody is willing to quit eating hamburgers. Nobody's going to quit eating cheeseburgers for the sake of the planet, including the fucking climate scientists I knew. So again, the woman I was like roommates with, again, actually separate rooms in the house, but we don't have a word for this now. This woman I was like roommates with, she had been a vegetarian in the past, not even vegan. She had been vegetarian, and she stopped being vegetarian and went back to eating meat and cooking and eating meat because it was hard for her to get laid. It was hard for her sex life. Being a vegetarian, maybe you should eat a vegan diet and pay a fucking male prostitute. What can I tell you? It's just mind-blowing. What am I going to tell you? Maybe you should eat a vegan diet and develop an interest in Japanese men or something. I don't know. Her point was she was trying to get with white British guys, and all of them eat meat, drink alcohol, and watch soccer on TV. Hashtag not all British guys. The vast majority of these guys, even the guys with PhDs. I've met those guys. So she started eating meat for the sake of her fucking sex life. This is human nature. This is the reality of the world we live in. Okay, so look, moving from the surface of the Earth up into higher and higher orbit for just a moment. The next level up, so surface of the Earth, near Earth orbit, the next level up is actually having mirrored arrays reflecting away sunlight that are not rotating around the Earth, but that are at a point further out that is static in terms of the relationship between the sun and the Earth. So that doesn't really mean static, but it means you can imagine you have a mirror that is remaining in place relative to in between you and the sun. So as the sun orbits, as the Earth orbits around the sun, I'm pretty sure the sun is the center of the solar system. I'm pretty sure. But either way, however you look at it, if any of you don't accept Copernicus on this, as the Earth rotates around the sun, in that sense, it is orbiting the sun also. So most people call this geostatic orbit. A little bit of a confusing term, actually. But anyway, so you have an array that's orbiting in between the sun and the Earth. It's also orbiting the sun and is blocking rays from the sun. Now, again, to my knowledge, the difference in cost is so extreme. Like it's, you're comparing millions of dollars to tens of billions of dollars kind of thing, that it's not worth talking about. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. That's also worth looking at. Do you want to intercept the sun's rays even higher up? So the solutions I do hear discussed, interestingly, are solutions that are largely debunked or where their effects are trivial. People say you should take fewer flights. Look up the parts per million of carbon chart. And again, if it's a very current chart, you can see the radical reduction in international flights that took place during coronavirus had no impact. So we reduced international travel about as much as is humanly possible during the coronavirus period. You do not see dropping carbon levels. You do not even see a deceleration, a reduction in the total amount of carbon globally, or a solution to the global warming problem during this period. Now, a footnote, I have read studies that measure precisely how much carbon went into the atmosphere during the coronavirus period. There is a measurable difference. The reduction in flights, you can measure it. The difference is trivial ecologically. Now, imagine a science fiction universe in which this coronavirus thing happened and we all radically reduced the amount of international travel we did involuntarily because of this. And then, and you could see clearly this big drop on the carbon parts per million. We said, guys, we've discovered the solution. All we need to do is have, pandemic style restrictions on international travel forever. And we've solved the problem. We've solved global warming. Okay. An even more extreme, although brief, interruption in international travel happened after September 11th, 2001. Just go back further on the carbon parts per million. Can you see a dent? Can you see a reduction in carbon levels as this goes up and up and up following September 11th, 2001, when there was a massive reduction in flights that went on for quite a long time? So again, these are extraordinary circumstances that reduced air transport, and the results for ecology are trivial. You can't solve the problem by reducing the number of flights you're taking. And guess what, homie? If you don't sit in that seat, if you decide not to buy an airplane ticket, the airplane is going to take off anyway. Maybe someone else is going to buy the ticket and sit in the seat. Maybe the airplane company has to have a sale, or maybe the seat is empty. Plane's taking off anyway. The idea that you as an individual consumer can change the world by not buying that airplane ticket, it's utterly false. And yet this is the narrative we hear. And again, I'm not blaming the media. All of you are doing it as individuals on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. You're all saying it again and again in street protests, tearing off your clothes and dancing in the streets. This is the kind of horseshit that both professional scientists and amateur activists are indulging in again and again and again. The myth that through your personal virtue and refusing to travel by airplane between England and Spain when you go on vacation, be like, oh yeah, bro, oh yeah, the reduction in emissions because instead you drove a car onto a ferry and took a boat and then drove to the beach in Spain instead of flying. Do you want to add up the emissions from just the meals you ate during several days of overland transport? The amount of meat you ate while driving from Surrey, England to southern Spain, the Mediterranean coast of Spain, the amount of food you consumed, the number of days you spent in hotels or what have you, and the emissions of your car and the boat. You really think it's such a drastic difference from if you had just flown for this vacation? say the same about Greta Thunberg taking a boat between United States of America and Europe and this kind of thing. She's had some stunts like this where she travels internationally by boat instead of by airplane. And guess what? When you scale it up, when it's not just Greta Thunberg, when it's 10,000 people on giant luxury yachts traveling between the United States and Europe, and they're all eating meals every day. They're all eating and sleeping and going to the toilet. When it's tens of thousands of people, when it's millions of people, guess what? Abolishing airplanes turns out to be an ecological disaster instead of an ecological boon. It's all bullshit. And people are deeply committed to this bullshit model of how to deal with climate change instead of dealing with the brutal reality of what's possible and what's impossible. If we are now going to take drastic measures to have real measurable outcomes, to really change the fate of the world. So I mentioned before this idea of just stoking up the life cycle of the ocean, of increasing the lowest level of the food chain, increasing the microbiota, increasing single-cell plant organisms, single-cell animal organisms. That was a model that got a lot of heat in the newspapers. It got talked about. It's a totally false, totally unworkable model. It's a dead end. There was one other example that I wanted to discuss, and it's slipping my mind now, where the press kind of fastened onto something. I thought, oh, this is our. I'm sorry, if we want to get really grim, do you guys know this guy, Alan Savory? Alan Savory, who tried to save the world by telling you to eat more meat, that by farming more cattle, we're going to restore the soil, and we're going to save the world that way. Like, oh yeah, the effect of cow poo on the soil is so positive for the carbon balance that by farming more cattle. So, I mean, there have been some totally, totally false and easily debunked notions of ecology that the press became fascinated with, and the public at large became fascinated with. Yeah, sorry. I guess there's no point digressing into those kinds of debunked models. So Javier writes in. Hi, Javier. I haven't heard you in a long time. Heard from you in a long time, I should say. He says, quote, so the international agreement about not creating tools that are able to change the weather at a planetary level is the first we need to tackle. So, Javier, there is an international treaty against weather weaponization. Okay, so that's not against changing the climate at all. And it's very common for governments to do things to change the climate. The most common method is what's called cloud seeding, right? So this actually brings me back to the other big question, which is of cloud creation now. And even that treaty, the main signatories, the matter were Russia and the United States against weather weaponization. It doesn't forbid research. So the United States has had ongoing research into weather weaponization. That never stopped. So that's not really a problem in any which way. But obviously, if there were such a treaty, all you have to do is break the treaty. It's only a symbolic problem when you have a treaty and you break it, and then everyone else is free to break it too. But so it wouldn't really be a problem if that were the case. Another idea that I have seen discussed on television, on the internet, and so on, is the idea of cloud generation. And so actually, sorry, I should have listed this off. When you're increasing in altitude, talking about reflecting way more of the sun's rays on the surface, and then in near Earth orbit, and then more remote geostatic orbit. Well, in between, there's the question of white puffy clouds. So this is an idea that people like sort of aesthetically, but it is not practicable. And we've learned more about how clouds form and why it is that a puddle doesn't produce clouds, a stagnant pond doesn't produce clouds, freshwater swamps don't produce clouds, and the freshwater ocean does. It really is the ocean that produces clouds. The hope was that we could basically set up solar-powered pumps. So we can imagine you have a solar array on the surface of the Earth, and that energy is being gathered, and that's being fed into a pump that basically, not so different from a sprinkler on your yard, that's jetting the water up into a high arc, and then by having the water go up into the air and crash, this is going to generate more white clouds, more like really you're like creating a kind of waterfall, solar powered man-made waterfall. Now again, I'm sorry, you have to talk about this on a massive scale. So we'd be talking about filling the whole of Hudson Bay, Canada, with this. There's a lot wrong with it. There are a lot of ways in which it's not practicable. But sadly, the more you know about cloud formation, how white puffy clouds really are formed, as opposed to if you visualize a puddle in the desert, just kind of, it looks like it's steaming. It's not steaming, but a puddle in the desert, and you have this evaporation coming up. Evaporation itself does not form white puffy clouds. That's not how that happens on planet Earth. Now, I'm not going to digress into it, but actually the even more terrifying thing is understanding how the acidification of the ocean is going to negatively impact cloud formation. Broadly speaking, there's all of the effects of global warming. There are feedback loops whereby things get worse and worse and worse. So what do I mean by feedback loop? Yes, the ice is melting. Most people are concerned about the fact that melting ice means higher ocean levels. It's not the only effect. Permafrost in Siberia, especially, but permafrost around the world has locked into it methane and other greenhouse gases. So when the permafrost melts, a huge store of more greenhouse gases are released in the atmosphere. So that's a feedback loop. You get a little bit of warming. There's a knock-on effect like dominoes, and that causes even more warming. But in this same way, sadly, our expectations about cloud formation are getting worse and worse. And just to end the digression on that issue of having basically little boats that would be solar power, you could have it built on the side of the ocean. Solar array absorbing this light and then pumping water up in jets. Just think about the maintenance cost. So solar panels are not cheap. You're talking about this on a huge scale. This would be a multi-billion-dollar budget for something that is marginally effective, is barely effective, or maybe totally ineffective. As again, the science of cloud formation, as global warming itself makes cloud formation worse and worse and less reliable. Okay, so you have a team of scientists, multi-billion-dollar solar power facility with these jets. The ocean has waves. You have little boats floating around on the waves that are supposedly collecting enough solar power to run these pumps and pump out. Again, they're not producing clouds. They're just producing jets of water that go through the air. Woo. To get to the levels of effectiveness of the other solutions, I think basically it's impossible to get to a comparable level of effectiveness. By contrast, producing many, many miles of mylar, you can even poke holes in it to make it a little bit more ecological. You could have mylar that has like a Swiss cheese pattern. You have a reflective array and stretch it over the Gobi Desert or what have you, or you have a satellite array, so on and so forth. It is really not plausible to me that this leads to something positive. Okay, so we have been through a list of drastic measures, possible putative solutions in these facing this drastic challenge. And the main thing I have wanted to emphasize again and again and again is that you people are donating your money and donating your time to fundamentally false gods, to counterproductive, pointless political movements like Extinction Rebellion. And governments are spending huge amounts of money on conferences of scientists that I could also in brief refer to as false gods. And strangely, we have developed a kind of subculture attached to global warming, both amongst the scientists and amongst the activists, that is in no way committed to or interested in solutions. That's only interested in earning a good living out of measuring the problem. Everything would be very different if you had a kind of military attitude towards this, which is like, look, we're interested in winning this war as quickly as possible and brutally as possible. And then the science and the political messaging is subservient to that solution, where you're thinking solution first, as opposed to endlessly measuring and debating the extent of the problem. Again, I'm not idealizing the military, but my point is with military planning, if your point is the solution to this problem is to conquer Russia, then you have that solution that fixed, and then you start thinking about the technologies you're going to use. You start thinking about you start thinking about the different options in approaching that solution, as opposed to talking about the problem. Which again, it's possible it's because the scientists and the activists spend time together. They may meet up and drink wine together at these conferences, wine and cheese, I would imagine. And the great stark contrast to everything I've said up to this point in this video is veganism. And I do not mean voluntary veganism. I mean coercive veganism. The reality is, if we start having coercive government-driven, oppressive measures to compel people to radically reduce the amount of meat they eat. And again, this is just an ecological lecture. This is not a morality lecture. The most important meat for us to eliminate is cow meat, pig meat, chicken meat. It's terrestrial animal meat. Ethically, I don't eat whales, I don't eat dolphins, I don't eat fish, but it's true. In terms of what really matters for ecology, what really matters, the highest priority is cows, drastically reducing the number of cows. Pop quiz, Ireland. Republic of Ireland. Are there more cows or more people in Ireland? The cows outnumber the people. I looked up the statistic recently. Maybe we should have an international agreement that no country in the world can have more than one cow for every 10 people. It'd be a drastic reduction in beef production. Now, again, ideally, you'd have 0 cows. You just eliminate cows. The thing is about veganism, whether it is voluntary or it is coercive, that doesn't just reduce the amount of solar radiation coming into the earth. It doesn't just deal with the problem of solar energy coming in and causing global warming. That actually will solve the fundamental problem of the carbon balance in the atmosphere. It will also free up an unimaginable amount of land, by the way, that can revert to being forest because it is no longer being used for either the cattle themselves or to grow soybeans that are fed to the cattle, sometimes to grow sweet corn that's fed to the cattle. It's not just soybeans. Guess what? Suddenly, we can expand the amount of forest, whether that's rainforest or otherwise. So we have a lot of land we can't use. We also just increase the efficiency of human life as a whole, and we reduce the total number of mammals as a whole on the planet. We reduce the amount of poo, the amount of sewage going into the rivers and oceans. Veganism alone changes everything. Veganism alone solves the fundamental problem of global warming. And again, it has to be coercive. It has to be. Do you have a better way to eliminate, the use of cocaine in the United States of America? I love all this idealistic reasoning. Well, we're just going to wait for a kind of spiritual awakening. We're just going to wait for people to be so enlightened and so highly ethical and moral and so intellectually advanced that cocaine just goes out of fashion. Cocaine is like blue jeans, motherfucker. It keeps coming back. It doesn't matter if your older brother died of a cocaine overdose. It doesn't matter if you saw your best friend in high school ruin his life by using cocaine. You are still in use, and you are still at risk of becoming a cocaine addict. Cocaine never disappears. It never dies, okay? The only way to reduce the levels of cocaine addiction on planet Earth is through coercion, is through oppression. It's by locking up and putting in jail everybody involved, the people importing it, the people dealing it, the people using it. It's by having blood tests for cops on the job and firing and putting in prison every single police officer who tests positive for having cocaine in his own bloodstream. Have you ever heard that discussed before? How about zero tolerance for drug use among police officers? Zero tolerance for drug use among politicians. Shout out to Kwame Kilpatrick. The mayor of Toronto at one time admitted to using crack cocaine. The mayor of Detroit admitted to using crack cocaine, using cocaine generally. What percentage of politicians are themselves using these drugs? What percentage of police officers, whether on the weekend or not? If you want to not even eliminate cocaine, if you want to drastically reduce the drug addiction problem in our society, the only viable option is coercion, is oppression. You just get to choose what flavor of oppression you want, what variety of oppression you want. And the whole bullshit discourse about defund the police in 2020, it revealed that the greatest fucking idea these leftist woke-tards had was to replace the role of the police officer with somebody who has a fucking PhD in psychology, who does exactly the same thing. Like, oh, it would be so much better if when you call 911, instead of a police officer, it's a fucking psychiatrist who shows up at your door. Yeah, great. So do you know how much you have to pay a psychiatrist? And it's still going to be a psychiatrist with a gun, okay? It's still going to be a psychiatrist who has the ability to arrest you. Okay, yeah, great. The world sure would be a better place if it had been a team of psychiatrists or psychologists who showed up, in response to these 911 calls that ended in police brutality. Did you know any psychologists? Again, like I said about scientists, they're terrible human beings. Anyway, This is ridiculous. They don't actually have an alternative model for policing. Well, guess what, motherfucker? It's not 1983 anymore. It's 2023. It's time to get serious about coercive veganism. It's time to get serious about ugly, oppressive government policies that will drastically reduce the number of cows on this planet, that will drastically reduce the number of pigs. And I will remind you, I am a nihilist. I don't care how immoral you are. I do not care if you are Vladimir Putin, the semi-elected dictator of Russia, and I do not care if you are the crown prince ruling over Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or some Muslim dictatorship. I don't care if you're the fucking military junta in Myanmar or you're a leading member of the Communist Party in China. If you are a totally immoral person and you don't give a fuck how many animals have to be tortured to death so you can have a cheeseburger, this has become a pragmatic emergency. This has become an ugly solution to an ugly problem. And I shouldn't have to spend my time propagandizing you to get you to perceive something ugly as beautiful. You are facing a fork in the road. Either you want to drastically reduce the human population of planet Earth, or you want to reduce the animal population. Do you want to reduce the number of cows on the planet, or do you want to reduce the number of humans? Because those are the two and only two options for actually solving the problem of carbon parts per million in the atmosphere, which is, as I've explained to you, the more fundamental problem than merely mitigating the total amount of solar radiation that makes it in through the atmosphere, that gets absorbed into the surface of the earth or the ocean. The future of the vegan movement is you.